Let's now consider the issue of what does a good case look like? There are good cases and there are bad cases. I'm arguing that a good case is field-based. It presents a real issue, not an imagined one, an armchaired one, or one that is implied by the theory. It's typically got a structure that provides, like any good novel, short story, symphony, a beginning, an opening gambit, if you will. There's going to be somewhere in there some historical context as to where this situation is coming from. In some cases it might be implied. In other cases it might be well described. There's going to be a little bit of a lead up into the issues or the problems that were likely at least hinted at or introduced in the opening. And then there's going to be probably a sequence of events that build up to almost a revisiting or a reprise of the opening gambit. So this is where some people criticize cases that there is this structure, and they say, well, John Smith was looking out the window at the snow falling on the lawn, trying to figure out what to do with his company. And they'll poo-poo that. Now, if that's an armchaired case, I would also agree that's not very useful. If it's a real person and this really happened and he's wrestling with this set of issues, then it's not going to have that same sort of cliched feel to it, by the way, as many of our academic research articles do, with a similarly kind of rigid structure. But the point is, by the end of the case, the reader should have been introduced to a set of dilemmas, been given sufficient data so that there's enough to analyze the situation, even if some of that means leaving some data out, so you have to project or imagine what data you need. And probably, to make it more real and honest, some quotations. Because you and I both know that every person in every situation looking at a particular problem are not going to look at it in the same way. So if the author of the case has written it so that there's just one point of view, which is one problem that many magazine journalists have with writing cases, they typically, historically, have been trying to lead a reader to a culmination, a climax, a kind of nifty little ending. Whereas in a case, we want it to be much more open and unsettled at the end of the material, so that students have to now go, what do I do now? I've got this, I've got this, I've got this, I could go here, I could go there. How do I fold all this in? Which is where they begin to get that repetitive experience of sifting through a little bit too much data, sorting out from their own vabes what's important and what's not. At level 2, then analyzing all of that before they come into class at level 1 with a set of recommendations for here's what I would do if I were in that situation. So quotations can add a lot of realism to a case. Again, we want to make sure that we give students data, not conclusions. Even when you're describing people in a case, some authors make the mistake of saying Jack was a jerk or Mary was a bitch or whatever, when what they should be doing is giving quotations or describing behavior and letting the readers draw their own conclusions about who these people are. Cases can be and should be written to intended audiences, whether it's at the executive level, the management level, or the undergraduate level. People in classes want to identify with the protagonists or the key players in a case situation. So when you're developing or picking a case, you want to pick one that is relevant for that group. If you pick too many chief executive perspective cases for an undergraduate group, they may tune out because they just can't identify with what it's like to be in that situation. Now, there's some judgment about, do you want to extend people's perspective? Do you want to give them some thoughts about what it's like to be the President of the United Nations, or the President of the United States, or the President of GM, or the President of your local donut shop? So pick something that's relevant for your intended audience. I would encourage you to, even if it's not in the case, before you teach it, make sure you know in your mind the decision point of view that you want to have the class wrestle with. So the decision maker may or may not be the protagonist presented in the case. Typically it is. So the chief financial officer was wondering what his or her debt to equity ratio should be for the company and how would that affect its ability to finance ongoing operations and strategic expansion. Or if it's the human resources officer trying to figure out whom we should hire and how do we go about finding those people, or operations and so forth. But the point is that even though there may be a protagonist presented in the case, you may find a situation where if you were, as the instructor, able to elevate, say, to that person's boss, and how would you assess this person's performance in that situation? Students or readers typically don't expect that. They find that a new wrinkle and they're going, whoa, I never thought about that, because the case invited them to get inside a little bubble of perspective, which frequently, if you can pull them out of that, it will help them realize that I should not let the case define my thinking. Like that old 9-dot creative thinking idea, can you connect the 9 dots with 4 lines that never, where your pencil never leaves the paper? And to do that, you have to go outside of that 9-dot box. Well, it's the same for a case. When you're teaching it, you can either get wrapped up inside the case, and students will do the same, or you can also teach yourself to think about, are there other perspectives, maybe the lenders, maybe the customers, maybe the investors, maybe the boss, maybe a competitor who's looking at this company and trying to make a decision about how it would respond to this company's strategic actions, for example. Okay? Length is a big issue. We try to get shorter and shorter cases these days because it seems like in the current cohorts, attention span is shortening and shortening with our technological, digitally based world. We try to get cases 15 pages or less. I've taught very successfully cases of 2 or 3 pages. One of the all-time classics, the Dashman case, is only 2 pages long. It's still relevant in many ways, even though it was written back in the late 1940s. So there are classic cases. Just looking at the copyright date of a case is no guarantee that it's a bad choice or a good choice. A later case may be horribly written and not very functional. A much older case might be very well written, have classic issues in them that can, like Scripture, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, be used over and over and over again to help people understand recurring issues in the private sector. So just because a case has an old copyright, don't throw it out. That said, you and I both know the students look at the copyright, now this is old, doesn't have anything to do with me. They immediately begin to discount it. As the instructor, you can manage that. And it depends on how you set it up and how you present it and how the discussion unfolds, where people may go in saying this is old and they come out saying, wait a minute, that is so fresh. There's that issue of, well, if you don't know history, you can't learn from it and you might be doomed to repeat it. So let's not throw the classics like the baby out with the bathwater and only search for new cases. You could find older cases that exactly fit, and particularly in terms of length. Now, some cases are 45, 50, 60 pages long. For me, I don't know students who are willing to do that. So my rule of thumb is I want it to be 15 pages or less, single-spaced. May add some exhibits at the end. If I can get them down to 7 or 8 pages single-spaced, so much the better. So then there's this issue of writing style. Like empirical journal articles, cases can have a sort of anesthetic style, depending on the writers and how they're going about it. In some cases, institutions will put publishing or documentary formatting constraints on a case in the desire of standardization. So like McDonald's, everywhere you go, if you get a Big Mac, it's a Big Mac, it's a Big Mac. On the other hand, wherever you go, it's always a Big Mac. There's nothing new and fresh about it. So when you write a case or when you're picking one to use in a course, I invite you to look at how well it's written. Just because it's a case doesn't mean it's well written. There can be contradictory evidence that was a mistake rather than intended. There can be good grammar, bad grammar, misspellings. There can be poor formatting, any number of issues. And particularly, even if the formatting and the grammar is right, the language might be boring. So look for a case that's got a little bit of lyricism, a little poetic feel to it, that has like a symphony or a good piece of literature, a short story, a poem even, has a cadence. Those cases, even though students may not be conscious of them, it'll settle deeper, it'll feel better, they'll be more engaging to people, and they'll come up and say, gee, I really enjoyed reading that case, as opposed to, I got to read another case, right? So a little bit of professional writing skill, not necessarily journal article writers or newspaper people. They have different styles. But there is a case writing style that is more effective than others. And then perhaps one of the most important things is every case should end with multiple options. If you write a case that has one conclusion and one conclusion only, it's just a glorified problem set. Right? There's a right answer, and it's not very interesting. Now, students may say, I want you to tell me the right answer. That's a separate issue. We'll talk about that. But with regard to writing a case or picking a case for your course, you want to make sure that you get those that have multiple possibilities at the end. And not just necessarily on one decision, but could be on multiple decisions. So people in finance or operations might say, well, no, wait a minute. There is a proper calculation of the net present value here. There's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. Or there are real reasons why this is a bottleneck and how we need to fix that to release that bottleneck in an assembly line or a process flow. Fair enough. But then if you've reached that calculation, what do you do with it? How do you go convince your other colleagues that you need to make this change? What's your argument? Can you make it in a way that they respond? Can you get them to agree? So in my view, every class is an opportunity for students to practice the art of persuasion, the art of leadership, and getting other people to do what you want them to do, even if your analysis can be narrow or broad. Okay, so multiple options at the end of a case so that students can say, could go here, could go there, sets up a lot of wonderful educational opportunities.